Thank you for that lovely introduction. I don't think I've ever been called a visionary curator before, so I feel really special, y'all. I was going to do an introduction, but you did it for me. So yeah, I'm Gerald Packard, a painter, artist, curator. I've been in Omaha for about 3 years now, and I'm thrilled to be here and continue to learn about the arts community here in Omaha. With thinking about critical, the theme for this month, I wanted to talk a little bit about the lens of criticality that artists bring to their practices and to the world. But before we dive in, I was told that this is like not a heavy fine arts community, so I wanted to, or audience, so I wanted to think a little bit about like the myth of the artist and this idea of what kind of function they play in our world. And I think I encounter sometimes this like folks who maybe don't have a lot of exposure to artists, who kind of like encounter me as a way of being like different, an outsider, kind of like sometimes a cultural trickster, thinking about like this artist who has this privileged vantage point from outside of society. Like here we have Van Gogh, who's like, of course, with his cut off ear, Jackson Pollock, who, you know, strut through his career in a haze of alcoholism. So this idea that like we're somehow like tortured souls, and that gives us this ability to be this creative genius to comment on the world that we live in from a unique perspective. Interestingly, a lot of these characters are cis, straight, white men. And so I'm interested in kind of re-examining this idea of what an artist might be through the lens of criticality and art activism. So I don't know if y'all have been into an art class, but one of like the Art 101 cornerstones to being an artist is the crit. And if you've never been in a crit, I just literally Googled crit, and this is the image that came up. It's a really simple format in art classes all over the country. You get an assignment, you bring in your work, throw it on the wall, and then you are subjected to the gauntlet of your peers critiquing you. And this is really a space of where you can test out new ideas, get peer feedback. I've seen female artists encounter their first encounter with like misogyny, being dismissed as like, oh, cutesy. I've seen artists cry in critique. So like this is a really generative space where delusions of grandeur like projected onto their careers. This is a space where we can really flesh out, challenge ideas, and think about ways that we can develop kind of collective knowing together. And I wanted to like start with that idea, this idea of a critique and developing knowledge in community with one another. With that in mind, I want to just talk through a couple of my curatorial projects, which I think tap into some of these ideas and hopefully start to reshape this idea of what an artist can do for the world. Reflex Space was a project I did in 2017. It was in the wake of Trump's election, during great kind of social and political distress. And it includes 14 artists that, over the course of several weeks, activated this one room and built layers of kind of workshops, sculptural interventions, and over that time, there became this like accumulation of material that built a layered meaning as it continued to grow. And I was interested in how artists can, again, think about kind of a collective response, an organic response to a political moment. We're watching voices feeling unheard in this moment. We're seeing militarization of the border. We're seeing women feeling disenfranchised and marginalized. And these artists, I think, tap into some histories that help us process in a cathartic way and reimagine new futures and ways of engaging this distraught moment. So this is Cass Davis. This is one of the first projects here. It was called Whose Good Old Days? And you can see one of the performers in this was wearing America Was Never Great. And this came out of Cass's childhood growing up in like rural Illinois town, where they witnessed kind of these town parades. And through kind of investigative research, realizing that these parades were kind of founded in KKK roots, that those were kind of the origins of these public displays of togetherness. And so they reimagined that parade as kind of a proclamation of queer and POC communities. So they set up this tableau vivant in the gallery space. There's kind of these hay bales to recall this rural environment, and this like kind of old-timey bunting up on the top to kind of think about kind of this fake nostalgia. I want to call it fake nostalgia. A certain nostalgia that privileges certain histories over others. You can see the kind of like the remnants of that performance are still here and laid the groundwork for a performance by Gerald and Angelo Terrell, who did a very emotional, cathartic reading of from their Black Boy Colored kind of text, which was essentially a diaristic account of childhood bullying, domestic violence, a life-changing HIV diagnosis, and really heavy stuff, but again, framed within this kind of like backdrop of Cass's performance, and thinking about how those histories are beginning to intersect. We moved some of the hay bales out of the way for this next project because we needed some space, but this is Nuria Montiel, who designed these floor glyphs with these labyrinthine structures that reference ancient Mexican kind of architecture and design. From her native Mexico, working and living in Chicago, she was really trying to locate belonging in space, in her space and environment, and collected this soil from different sections of Chicago and bound it together with nopales, like the cactus juice. So it became kind of concrete and created these floor stencils. So thinking about merging like the ground that she's living on with this ancestral kind of heritage and design motif is trying to think through her identity in kind of this diasporic lifestyle. Marcela Torres, they performed a kind of a dance, an untrained dance. They're not a trained dancer. They do some martial arts, but part of that was thinking about what does it mean for someone who's untrained to perform. And they created like an audio feedback loop and invited anyone in the audience to start speaking. So we start to hear these layers of voices, and they're kind of like awkward, kind of sometimes violent gesticulations and movements through the galleries, frequently threatened and also sometimes destroyed Montiel's floor designs. So again, thinking about these relationships and how stories can be built in community with one another. Adela Goldbard and Emilia Rojas are a kind of a collaborative team. You can again see the beginnings of accumulations from some of the floor glyphs on the floor as they begin to, and like the bunting on the top, as they're continue to build a web of new conversations within one another. So they were interested in the story of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was kind of, and his missing leg. He had a prosthetic leg. You can see one hung on the wall in the back there. And he was kind of blamed for losing most of the country's territories in the Mexican-American War. There was a myth that was spun out of this kind of critique of him that the Americans took his leg and like used it as a baseball bat, kind of like to shame or embarrass him. And so Adela and Emilio kind of took on the role of mythbusters and were like, let's actually try to use use a prosthetic leg to do baseball. You can tell I don't do sports. To do the baseball. Okay. And so I think this is a great example of how artists can revisit and unearth new histories and start to envision new possibilities within those sometimes like monolithic histories. Connor Stetchelty did a printmaking workshop, invited folks to come in and design their own posters, which were then printed through a risograph printer and distributed in this gallery space so anybody could come through and take these posters away. And this was an important gesture for me because it's the idea of like information sharing and skill building, and I think that holding that in the same kind of tier as some of these more like fine art gestures invites kind of this democratic sharing of information and uplifting of each other's voices. Molly Colleen O'Connor, also known as DJ Shaky Shakes, curated a 3-hour radio program that was distributed on Chicago Public Radio and created this listening kind of lounge in the gallery. Was all, she called it apocalyptic themed, meaning it was all like bomb themed. So any song that had like bomb or warfare in it was curated into this list. So this is, for me, kind of like this cheeky way to reflect on this like the heaviness and the doomsday that I think a lot of folks were feeling, certainly the artists in this project were feeling in the wake of Trump's election. Elaine Rubinoff and Alex Payton Levine came in and decorated the space with these floral prints, kind of wax embalmed flowers, a lot of pink, and they were interested in challenging like these tropes of femininity and trying to elevate them from beyond their relegated status as like just trite or meaningless or something just beautiful to look at, and to consider it something, consider kind of like the emotionality and the sensitivity of some of these motifs as a legitimate point of criticality. And to present kind of the potency of the feminine. Kind of to round out this project, Maura O'Neill hosted a workshop, which is some equal parts guided meditation, video work, and you can see the participants laying on the ground as she kind of talks folks through the experience of groundlessness and the experience of unknowing, and trying to, through collectivity, build a sense of comfort while experiencing something destabilizing. So this next project, Stumble Chicago, came out of something of a failure or frustration on my part, living in Chicago and not really having opportunities or being frustrated that with all of the barriers to be able to participate in institutions, and which is, ironic now that I'm working with an institution looking back, but at the time it was a little bit of like a fuck you to systems that hold artists back from being able to participate and some of the problems of accessibility around the art world. And so what this project did was it proposed small gestures of creativity that were interspersed throughout the city. So we didn't require anyone's approval or authority's validation to do something. I just worked with artists to help realize an idea. Most of them are small gestures, and so I think there was something about challenging the monumentality or the grandeur of artwork that you might find in a bigger institution, and hoping that these things would be encountered by folks who would never otherwise seek out art. So Gerald, Angelo, Terrell, who we saw a little bit earlier, I did another project with them, printed out these small stickers that we walked around the downtown of Chicago and started slapping them on different buildings, so you can see the iconic like corn towers down on the Chicago's riverfront in the background. And Daryl Terrell, as like a 6'6", gender nonconforming individual, talks about the way that they feel like a target anytime they move through public spaces. And they were interested in capturing these small moments of care and support through these statements, make smart choices, get home safely, that they would share with their community anytime they were exiting private spaces to get home at the end of the night. And while this one says, yeah, get home safely, please. On one hand, they're, small statements of care. On the other, they point to the inherent violence that folks like Daryl and their community experience every time they try to take the T home. This one's particularly poignant because you can see the Trump Tower in the background. Aaron Smego is interested in fast fashion, and these like awkward little structures are made out of kind of industrial materials, scrap wood. You can frequently see the like nuts and bolts as they're joined together, and thrifted clothing items. To me, there's something like a parody of a mannequin. They're kind of pointing to the falseness of the slick, chic mannequins that you might see in a Zara or a storefront. We distributed a series of these small sculptures along the 606, which you can see this jogger on the right, which is like this strip of what I think used to be like a railway car, but was turned into this running path. Really great urban development project, also a means for gentrification. And there's something about thinking how this fast fashion industry distributing clothing at a really fast pace to appease our desire for novelty and keeping up with trends, but at the cost of a lot of material being thrown into landfills and almost always abusive labor practices. And I think the proposal here is thinking about how our consumption of fashion might also echo our consumption of art and artists. Jacqueline Sturdell is an athlete, and she uses fibrous ropes to create these really stamina-driven, labor-intensive weavings. So for this project, she wanted to essentially draw in space through rope. So here we are in like an abandoned lot underneath the CTA, and just creating urban contours, kind of reimagining our relationship to urban environments, to space, through this kind of formal drawing process. This project, Ditch Seed, was something I curated last summer here in Omaha at the Generator Space. This project came out of a slightly different line of inquiry or questioning, and I was interested in how to, as opposed to going to an artist and be like, I want to show this piece or create this conversation. I was living in Omaha. I had moved here pretty recently, and I was encountering some things that I'd never encountered before. And I was interested, selfishly, to create a set of conditions where I just got to investigate the things that I was interested in. And part of that process was reaching out to artists who already shared some of those concerns. And I was interested to understand, it was the first time I lived in a red state. I was like, what is this political set of ideologies? How does it inform the space that we live in and the geographies we navigate? And the prairie, which frankly I knew very little about. Like Little House on the Prairie and like maybe some paintings, but like I didn't really know about it as an ecological space. And so I invited these artists with those questions, and it turned into this like lengthy, research-driven process that was truly collaborative. We tried to hold foundational knowledge, think of kind of like academic forms of knowing, theoretical literature, along with like experiential knowledge, so ancestral or artistic knowing or bodily knowing. And so our research processes really try to hold both of those things at the same time. So that meant spending a lot of time in prairies, walking around, trying to think through like the optical experience of prairies. There's something really unsettling and profound about seeing a horizonless environment 360. It also meant that we reached out to scientists and ecologists. We work with the Prairie Plains Resource Institute in Aurora, Nebraska, who has a stellar team of ecologists, and they're doing amazing work trying to revitalize our prairies, which we found out are like less than 1% of what they once were. This is just like pretty jarring. The title of the show, Ditch Seed, comes from one of our conversations with these scientists, where we learned that they collect some of the rarest kind of like seeds from the ditches along highways. And we thought this was a really poignant kind of gesture. On one hand, kind of sad and pathetic that they're like scavenging the highways to be able to find these rare grass species. On the other hand, there's something kind of optimistic about the resilience of the prairie, that it's still able to exist in these liminal spaces. So this is us out on the Prairie Plains Resource Institute land, learning about what they do. The focus, like the main part of this installation, was this fragmented photograph of a landscape. You can see how we've turned, or the artists have turned each photograph into like a target. We went to Tactical 88, which we heard rumors was kind of like a space for neo-Nazi congregating. We shot guns there, learned how to shoot guns. I had never really shot a gun before. That's like so East Coast of me. We were interested in the constructedness of this space. There's something about, or at least amongst the artists, kind of reflecting on how driving for hours through cornfields, there's kind of this sense of like sereneness or kind of like pleasantness, and learning a little bit more about these histories of colonization and firearms, which are, decimated the native population and much of the buffaloes that really kept these ecosystems alive. We began to think about like how the fakeness of this space, and perhaps it wasn't so serene and pastoral as an initial impression might tell you. The back of these, you can see the target a little bit better here. The backside of these had been shot with a shotgun that we were playing with. So on one hand, you have kind of like this invitation of a target. On the backside, as you walk around, you have this really clear gesture of violence. The character that you saw in that first photo was each of the artists kind of took turns wearing this ghillie suit. And we took the video piece is kind of this character in this ghillie suit who kind of became this folkloric non-person navigating and just walking through the prairie landscape with a shotgun. On the right-hand side here, you can see some shotgun shells that we deconstructed and then filled with prairie seeds. So on the left, you see a little pile of prairie seeds. And we were interested in creating this kind of mythic character, a nameless character, who was doing this Sisyphean task through the narrative of this video. It was all silent, just collecting seeds, shooting shotgun shells full of seeds, of like trying to repair the prairie. And I think it was something of like an elegy, a poetic statement to commemorate a legacy and an ecosystem that will never be again. But there's also maybe a little bit of hope in there too, that like this almost like ghost of our cultural imagination is still out there trying to heal, trying to repair. Moving into a little bit more of like contemporary moments, not contemporary, just like the now moment. So in my role as the exhibitions manager at the Bemis Center, I started this public program called Public Assembly. The idea of this program was to invite members in the community who are doing amazing, incredible work, and activists, community organizers, artists, musicians, to welcome them into our galleries and essentially empower them to have whatever conversations they want, to connect the themes of our exhibitions to the social, political, and cultural landscape of Omaha. And I think it's important to note there's a challenge in art institutions like the one we're in, like in the Bemis Center, where on one hand we're trying to uplift and spotlight artists who are doing amazing work, but we also need to acknowledge the artists in our community around us at our doorstep. And so this was a way for me to try to bridge that conversation and empower artists to have like the conversations that they want to have. I think a lot about how institutions can effectively deauthorize themselves. We're so, the kind of like art world is so caught up with buttressing its own authority and making those who are in power, whether it's an institution or a person, finding more power and just not being able to acknowledge the authority that they have. And so this is a small way that we can step back and say, we're not the authority here. There's other ways of knowing that are beyond, a scholar or an academic giving a lecture or writing a wall text. You, meaning the community, your forms of knowing, your forms of learning, and generating new knowledge in community with one another is as valid, as legitimate. I also want to plug my upcoming curatorial project, which I'm working on presently, which will run from December 9th to April 16th at the Bemis Center. It's called Opulence, Performative Wealth and the Failed American Dream. And it assembles a group of artists that, everything from fashion to nail artistry, sculpture, video, and all of them are working in this like sumptuous, lavish aesthetic. Some might term gaudy or tacky. I don't use those terms with like a value judgment attached. And I'm interested in how these performances of wealth through these over-the-top aesthetics, very campy aesthetics, can talk about the failure of social mobility in our country, how marginalized communities, queer, POC communities, have systemic barriers to overcome in order to participate in the American dream, and really thinking about the false promise of the American dream. So on the left-hand side, Max Colby, she collects all kinds of miscellaneous materials, rhinestones, objects through like the markets in New York City, and assembles these like cushion, phallic-like mini sculptures. And there she talks about how strange it is to combine these textiles and materials that are coming from really different worlds, from a Chinese market, or kind of these motifs that reference, I don't know, a Russian opulent kind of Rococo style, and to throw them into the same space through these sculptures, and thinking about how the conditions of capitalism and globalization kind of like stir our kind of aesthetic sensibilities into this slurry hodgepodge. So thinking about how we can construct and perform identity under the conditions of capitalism. I think part of this project that I'm particularly excited about is including artists that might not typically be considered like fine artists. So Imagine Ulenbach on the right is an outstanding nail artist here in Omaha who runs her own business, and I'm smitten by her craft and invited her to create a pop-up salon in our gallery. So you can make an appointment, you can come to the Bemis Center and get your nails did. It's gonna be really cool. Two other artists, Devin Shimoyama on the right. It's like taller than me and taller than me wide, this piece. It's like all glitter, camped out, and thinking about kind of like this space of dazzling as a space of like aligning chakras and self-care. On the left is Felicia Savage, another kind of like non-fine artist. She's an amazing trans activist and entertainer here in Omaha. And just last week, I was chatting with her about how we're going to translate that kind of practice into a gallery space. And I went over to her house and saw her closet, and it's just like overload of like glamour earrings as big as. I was like talking about finding a mannequin. I was like, girl, I don't know how we're gonna find a mannequin with boobs that will fit your dresses. And so we had to talk about that. So like these are the frictions and challenges of translating a non-fine art practice into a conventional white cube gallery space, but one that I think is really important to expanding our notions of like what fine art can and should be. So those are some of my projects. I want to kind of like revisit this idea of the myth of the artist as somehow like outside of society, and think about rather the artist as like integral to society, embedded within. And again, thinking about like the critique space as a place where we can like test out new ideas, generate interpretation and meaning in conversation with one another, hone our intellect and taste and values. These are the spaces that are foundational to activism, and we build skills to decipher truth and untruth in conversation with one another, to doggedly pursue narratives of inquiry and upend historical arguments. Sometimes I like to think about artists as having the ability to change the past, not in the sense that they can get in a time machine and like go back and change things, but in revisiting and reimagining our histories and therefore changing the way that we relate to that history, essentially changing the past. They crack open the possibilities of new futures through doing this. I like to think of the artist as kind of like a raw, exposed nerve that feels things more acutely and sees things more intensely than maybe the rest of us, and can function something like a cultural watchdog that can be barking before the rest of us caught up with our day-to-day lives, even know something's happening. I want to end on this quote from Greg Bordowitz, which I think really sums up the possibilities of art. I think the most radical thing a work of art can do is to constitute a new audience, a group of people that never imagined themselves sitting in the same room. This is still the radical potential of art, this capacity to form what we used to call coalitions or alliances or affinities across boundaries of difference, to constitute a new audience, and new constituencies, as opposed to appealing to a demographic. Constituencies have interests. Demographics are groups of consumers. And constituencies can overlap, coexist. In other words, they allow us to conceptualize a public that isn't monolithic, where different groups can have different stakes in these incredibly fraught debates. So thank you for coming out and building a new constituency and a new audience together. Appreciate y'all.